Chicago is fully under siege right now between the National Guard, ICE, and the all-out war that Trump is waging on America's cities. It's bad, and there's a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. Things are moving very quickly on the ground here. Today, we saw the story break that Illinois and Chicago filed a lawsuit aiming to stop President Donald Trump's administration from sending hundreds of National Guard troops to the city, just as troops prepared to deploy, and hours after a federal judge blocked troops from being sent to Portland, Oregon. I think it's actually very promising that a federal judge was able to block troops from being sent to Portland, Oregon, because it sets a precedent for a similar block to be put in place as it pertains to Chicago, but only time will tell if that's possible. Governor J.B. Pritzker did post this on Threads yesterday evening. He said, "This evening, President Trump is ordering 400 members of the Texas National Guard for deployments to Illinois, Oregon, and other locations within the United States. No officials from the federal government called me directly to discuss or coordinate." So much to unpack here. First of all, sending National Guard troops from a whole different state is outrageous. Second of all, doing so with zero consultation with local leadership, and in fact, overriding the explicit desires of local leadership, is straight up fascism. Like, at this point, I don't know how you can sit there and be like, no, this is within his jurisdiction. This is a gross overreach of his jurisdiction, okay? The governor then says, "We must now start calling this what it is, Trump's invasion." You know what? I think that's exactly right. And I've been seeing a lot of interesting discourse. We'll talk about this more later in the video, but specifically about the incident that happened in South Shore, where a bunch of people were dragged out of their homes in the dead of the night, many of whom were citizens, many of whom were children, and detained by ICE. That's not a raid. That is an invasion. And honestly, I think it's pretty rich coming from the party that claims to want rights to go back to states, but are overriding the rights of states. It started with federal agents. It will soon include deploying federalized members of the Illinois National Guard against our wishes, and it will now involve sending in another state's military troops. So just to be clear, not only is Trump federalizing the Illinois National Guard, he is also threatening to federalize the Texas National Guard and send them in to Illinois. That is outrageous. This next part made me cackle, not because it was unreasonable to say, I think this was the right decorum thing to say, but because it just seems so untenable. Pritzker says, "I call on Governor Abbott to immediately withdraw any support for this decision and refuse to coordinate." Now, you know what? I think it's great that our governor stated this explicitly, if nothing else for the record. But when I tell you I have absolutely zero confidence that Abbott would ever do anything morally upstanding, and if I sound salty, it's because I am. I spent a big chunk of my childhood in Texas, so I've seen Abbott's failed leadership up close and personal. I mean, we literally just saw these racist gerrymandered maps in Texas that Abbott cheered on and made possible. I was in Texas during the deep freeze, where because of failed leadership like Abbott, millions of Texans did not have heat in the dead of the winter, and some people lost their lives as a result of extreme weather that him and people like him want to gaslight you into believing is not climate change, because according to their Lord and Savior, it's a hoax. Also, when I was in Houston for the No Kings protest, Abbott was threatening to deploy the National Guard on peaceful protesters, literally just saying, hey, authoritarianism, bad. And he was like, how dare they send in the National Guard? Like, this is the kind of person we're talking about. This is a very reasonable appeal, but we're dealing with very unreasonable people. Republican Texas lawmakers they're not giving reasonable, they're giving racist. So there's that. Today, our Mayor Brandon Johnson, also signed an executive order prohibiting the use of city property for immigration. Here's a video of his remarks earlier today.
City property and unwilling private businesses will no longer serve as staging grounds for these raids.
Some of you might be thinking, well, what's the point of that? They can still do the operations. I actually think this is brilliant, and I'm gonna tell you why. So maybe because of this executive order, instead of ICE agents being able to pick up 200 people in a day, they're able to pick up 75 people in a day, because they have to take into consideration where they're conducting their operations to make sure that it's not contradicting this new executive order. And I think people underestimate the power of initiatives like this. The win isn't always gonna look like we kicked them out and they can't do the evil thing anymore. Sometimes the win looks like I'm making it harder for them to do something evil, right? And this is my problem with a lot of organizations and even like municipal governments in this moment is this preemptive compliance, right? These major organizations like Paramount bending the knee and doing away with DEI preemptively. That's how authoritarianism and fascism thrive. When you just lay down and accept an inequitable status quo instead of fighting tooth and nail against that status quo, because it's not inevitable, it's manufactured. And we have a responsibility to stand up, fight back. And inflection points like this are part of that stand up, fight back energy. So this is really important and exciting to see. And I hope that our leadership here in Chicago will continue to put more roadblocks like this in place as we're waiting for some of these legal fights to play out in courts. So this is an interesting one. Kristi Noem was denied entry into an Illinois municipal building a couple of days ago to use the bathroom. And let's watch that clip real quick.
Can we use the restroom? No, you cannot. We can?
Okay, all right, thank you. Interesting. That's what Governor Pritzker says is cooperation and keeping people safe.
Honestly, I think that was pretty funny. I also just find it rich that she's talking about, you know, Pritzker not wanting to cooperate. And it's like, brother, you are overriding the authority of local municipalities, of local and state governments to impose your bigoted agenda. Over and over again, we've heard Republicans say they want to give rights back to the states. But when it comes to the rights of states, in this very moment, their executive branch leader is fully overriding the rights of the states. So which is it? Do you want to be a king, or do you want to give the rights back to states? Because those two things are fundamentally contradictory. You can't do both. But that is just an ongoing trend, I feel like, with the Republican Party. It's just a whole gaggle of contradictions. You say you're the party of family values, and then you separate families in broad daylight. You say you're the party of family values, and then you don't want to give women autonomy to make healthcare decisions about their own bodies. The math is just not mathing. Stay mad. I don't know what to tell you. Let's talk about the Broadview Detention Center. So I went to this detention center a number of weeks ago with my friend. When I went, this was really before things started to escalate. So it was a pretty small group of us, and there really weren't any interactions with ICE agents at the time. Over the weeks since I was there, things have escalated drastically. By now, you've probably seen the disturbing video of an ICE agent trying to drive through a crowd of protesters at the Broadview Detention Center. You've also likely seen the video of Kat Abu-Ghazaleh, who's running for Congress here in Illinois' 9th District, being slammed to the ground by an ICE agent for simply exercising her First Amendment right. 13 protesters were also arrested there on Saturday. And they are simply protesting against the inhumane conditions that our immigrant neighbors are being kept in this particular detention facility. It's honestly so despicable. Things have become increasingly intense and tenuous at the Broadview Detention Center. I know there are folks in the political commentator and content creation space that I'm familiar with, Kat, Rachel Cohen, Qasim Rashid, who have been going to these protests. I just want to shout out and big up, my colleagues in this space who are literally putting their bodies on the line to fight for what they know and we know is right. I think especially in moments like this, it becomes overwhelmingly clear why we need creators, independent journalists going to these spaces, because the kind of coverage we're able to offer is just unfettered. I'm not with a major news outlet that mitigates what I can say and how I can say it beyond sort of the guidelines of the platforms on which we post. We really do have free reign to share our sentiments. And I think in a moment like this, where there is so much quashing of dissent and there is so much quashing of the truth, it's important to have people on the ground who will give it to you straight. So I would encourage you to continue following those folks who are in this space doing that work. And in general, if you're attending any protests in the Chicagoland area, please be safe. Things are escalating, and I think it's important that we all be mindful. Let's talk about South Shore. I know many of us have been extremely disturbed to learn about this ICE invasion that happened in a predominantly Black community just last week. People were dragged out of their homes in the dead of the night, some of whom were citizens, some of whom were children, screaming, crying, held at point. Property was destroyed. Now, I just want to be really clear, Black and brown communities are not new to this kind of violence from the government, okay? This is a continuation of a long history of subjugation and targeting. It's just got a different kind of oomph behind it because of the particular moment that we're in. It is not a mistake that ICE targeted this predominantly black neighborhood with this level of brutality. And what has me gagged is that I had the opportunity to interview Governor J.B. Pritzker a couple of weeks ago, and he literally predicted something like this would happen. He predicted the neighborhoods that were going to be targeted. And what do these neighborhoods have in common? Most of them are predominantly black, Latine, and or Hispanic.
We have ICE coming in to disrupt communities. South Shore they'll disrupt, they'll go to Pilsen, they'll go to Little Village, and they're gonna scare people. You know, they disappear people who are even US citizens just because they're black or brown. We have law-abiding people who've been here for 10, 20, 30 years. They're our friends, they're our neighbors, they're paying taxes, they're holding down jobs. Those are not people we should be kicking out of the country. Those are people we ought to be inviting to stay in the country.
That is not an accident, especially in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling that essentially allows ICE agents to target people based on things like race, whether or not they speak Spanish, and so forth. And that this kind of profiling is now legally permissible and protected, according to our Supreme Court, which is very blatantly and openly doing the bidding of the executive branch, which is a violation of checks and balances, because the whole point of having the legislative, executive, and judicial branches is that if one starts acting a little wonky, the other ones will put them in place. But when every single branch is aligned with this bigoted positionality and agenda, we have a problem. And that's one of the many reasons that it irks me when people say that voting doesn't matter, because, you know, we can have a conversation about how the systems that we've inherited are fundamentally broken, are fundamentally created for our subjugation, need to be burned down, reimagined. Okay, we can have a conversation about that. In the meantime though, harm mitigation matters. And this is why I personally believe we do have to opt into structural governmental systems like voting, like civic engagement, not because we necessarily wholesale think the systems are getting it right, but because if we disengage, those who wish us harm don't, they continue to engage. And then we cede our power to them when we don't make autonomous decisions when we can and where we can, while we can. So yeah, I think it's hella important that we show up, we vote is far from the only way that we need to resist authoritarianism, but it's a critical part of it. And as we get closer to midterms, I really hope people will think about that and take seriously the individual responsibility to show up to the ballot box, because I promise you it matters. You know, Trump has said that these cities are just crime ridden and he wants to use them as training ground for the military. Do you not realize how despicable it is to even say something like that? That you want to use US cities as training ground for the military? To use our tax dollars to pay for the National Guard, to pay for ICE, to come into our communities and disrupt our peace and brutalize people and intimidate people? Talk about just madness. Like, that is objectively so unhinged. The audacity. Especially given that these crime-ridden cities that are war zones like Chicago are more safe than a lot of Republican cities throughout the United States. So is it that the issue is actually crime, or is it that the issue is that the leadership here in Chicago just doesn't rock with your agenda as a regime, and so you want to flex your power in a retaliatory manner to try to make other people feel small? I'm gonna guess it's that. It's just always the pot calling the kettle black with these people, and I'm over it.